Welcome back to my astrology story series. Today, since we have already talked about the houses, the planets, and how to make the birth chart, roughly at least, I still felt like we haven't talked much about the planets. What they feel like, or how they are in terms of their characteristics, their personality. So I thought I would go a bit detailed into them. But prior to that, I need to mention the fact that in general, the planets, as they move from house to house, their power or their strength can either be increased or decreased. So we call this exalted or debilitated, or they can be normal as well, or sometimes they could feel friendly in certain houses. So yeah, there are four types, like how they feel like as they move on from one house to another. At the same time, these planets, not all of them, but some of them tend to move forward and at times move back. So we call moving forward direct and moving backwards as retrograde. Certain planets, but you can't really call them planets, even though I did classify them as planets initially, where I took Rahu and Ketu as planets as well as Saturn into one group. Actually, Saturn is a planet, but Rahu and Ketu, they don't actually exist up there in the sky. They're actually kind of like shadows that are formed as the moon rotates around Earth, and they probably, you can't find them up there. But then I would probably describe exactly what they are in future videos. So those two are supposed to be moving retrograde, in the sense they always move backwards. So yeah, so Rahu and Ketu always move backwards, while the rest of them, they can either move forward or backwards. So when I say backwards, I don't mean that the planets move backwards all the time. It's just that some of the planets, from the aspect of from our view from Earth, it looks as if they are moving away from us at certain times of the year or certain times of their transit. But majority of the time they move forward. And when people are born and when you make the birth chart, some of their planets could be moving backwards and some of their planets might be moving forwards. But Rahu and Ketu would always they will always move backwards, retrograde. So, where, for an example, if you take Saturn moves from the first to the second and the third and so on, while Rahu and Ketu move backwards. So if they were in the first house, since there are only 12 houses, Rahu would move on to the 12th house, to the 11th, and so on. Yeah. So, and so when it comes to these planets, I did classify them into several groups as Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu, being like negative sort of planets. And then I mentioned the fact that Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, and Mars is in another group, and Sun and Moon in another group. So yeah, there are three types, but these are some classifications, these are some categorizations that I've made. Probably the other astrologers might not do the same. So because even though there is like there's a concept of how these planets work and how they behave and what these houses are, I do use that old knowledge from the books and from the teachers that I come across. But I also try to bring in this concept into my life, and I try to interpret it in my own way. So sometimes the meanings can change. So yeah, don't take the information that I give here as solid, because it's how I interpret it. So some astrologers might not, like traditional astrologers might not do the same. So I need to mention that. And so yeah, I've actually got a really nice story to remember how these planets work. Except for Rahu and Ketu, the rest of them, I imagine them as being inside a palace. So in this palace, there's a king. The king is actually represented by the sun. because the son also represents the father in a family, or like authoritative figures like the government, like your president or prime minister. So I imagine this whole chart, or like this situation, as a palace, and the sun as the king in that palace. Well, the moon, I now take the moon as the queen. So the king, the queen. So the king is the sun and the moon is the queen. But in terms of a family, the moon is the mother in the family, and it also can describe your mind, whereas the sun actually describes the soul, because the mind is not constant, it changes, while the concept of the soul is one that is supposed to be fixed, or it's like the fixed nature that a person perceives when they meet you, when you meet a new person, you know. So depending on where their sun is, I could tell how other people would feel about them, but their moon would tell me what their actual intentions are, you know, something like that. So now we've talked about the sun, the king, we've talked about the moon, the queen, and now we move on to the prince and the princess. So the prince, I consider the prince as Mercury and the princess as Venus. Well, you could either take them as the daughter or the son of the king and the queen, or you could take them as the sun as Mercury, while the Venus as the princess that the sun married from another kingdom. So it could be either way, but yeah, so that's how I remember these first 4 planets: the sun as the king, moon as the queen, prince as the Mercury, and princess as the Venus. Now we've got Saturn, Jupiter left as well. So Saturn could either be someone with authority within that castle, or someone who oversees everything that is being ordered by the king. So the king could give an order, but Saturn, who is more like the judicial system or the court system or like the police, some kind of authority that actually sees, so who makes sure that the laws are being carried out, like people stick to the laws, and people do exactly according to the way they are being told. But I also consider Saturn as also one of the servants in the palace, the ones who are actually working for the king, working really hard in the kitchen or within the palace. I'm not talking about the guards, because that's separate. And I'm talking about anyone basically working within that castle to run that castle, to run the business or to run that system. Then now I've got Jupiter left, and so do I have Mars. So Jupiter is actually more like an advisor. So he's like a Jupiter in astrology is called guru. Even in my language, it's called guru. So guru actually means a teacher. So more like an advisor who actually advises the king, the sun, on what steps he should take. He may not actually make the decisions, because the sun might make the decisions, and Saturn might carry them out, but he will influence the king to make those decisions. So he's like an advisor. That's what Jupiter roughly is. And the last one, which is actually Mars. Yeah, Mars is actually the soldier. So now we've got a whole palace with the king being the sun, the queen being the moon, and then we have the prince and the princess, which is Mercury and Venus. Then we've got an advisor who is Jupiter. Then Saturn, who's either someone who's working, like servants working there, or anyone else that runs the system, And the last one, which is Mars. So Mars is actually, yes, a soldier. It could mean a lot more things than that. Like it could even mean war, like sharp objects. And so if someone was to have Mars in the second house, this is just an example, they could have like words that they speak that feel like other people might feel as if they're throwing knives at them. but using words. So because words can be weapons, right? So yeah, that's why. So and yeah, so I've basically covered all these planets according to how I see it. And as I mentioned, the strengths change. They can the strength increase or reduce, which is exalted and debilitated, and so on. Yeah, and so when you take someone's chart and when you look at it, I look at all these planets, but I have somewhat of a favoration, or more like I have more of an experience in terms of Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. So I have a tendency to always go for those. I mean, you can use that method if you like. I mean, like, it's not something that anyone taught me. I just came up with it. Like, I just thought that that's probably how I feel comfortable, reading a horoscope. And then, and I also feel they bring in most of the negativity, or they bring in most of the drama into anyone's life, or any human, anyone's life, or any kind of situation. So I always look at Saturn, then I look at Rahu and Ketu, and I try to describe the person according to those, because I feel when someone's to get all the good stuff, it'll eventually come to you. If you've done good deeds in your past lives, it will come to you. But and you don't have to be worried about it because it's good, right? Anyway, but people are worried about what's going to go wrong. So I would always want to tell them what's going to go wrong first, rather than telling them what's going right. Because if it's going right, it's going right. I mean, you don't really need to know more about it beyond that, right? And then I just stick to Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. I mean, I actually did a reading about 1 hour ago, just before this video, and I went through those 3 first. And then as I have this conversation with my client, I try to figure out what else they want. So and I also realized that Jupiter, okay, if you take Saturn is a very strong planet. It is really stubborn, it is very stationary, it is a no-nonsense planet. It just does whatever it wants, and everybody has to pay respects to Saturn. They really can't do anything much about that. And I'm really sorry for the noise, because the road's just close by, so sorry about that. I'm glad you made all the way through this video, but I think I want to add a few more things as well. And if since Saturn is such a serious planet, and when Jupiter moves into that, Jupiter moves into where Saturn is, Jupiter is the advisor, and also kind of try to advise Saturn, the one who's carrying out the rules. You should probably do it this way, you should probably do it that way. But Saturn doesn't really listen. He's not the kind of person that would listen, because he always gets his way. And even though the king is the one who is the head of the palace, the one who actually carries out the rules, who oversees all the laws and regulations, is the one with the most amount of power. Even though the figure, or like the figure of power, might look like the sun, but it's actually Saturn who's running the show underneath. So that's why I use Saturn, and I use Rahu and Ketu, because Rahu and Ketu always talks about desires. Rahu talks about desires, while Ketu actually describes about where you're comfortable at. So people always want to stay where they're comfortable at, that is Ketu, and they want to seek what they desire, which is Rahu. So even in the horoscope, Rahu and Ketu are placed right opposite each other, like every single time. That's how it's planned. And then so I use those 3 a lot. Then also see how Jupiter affects Saturn and Rahu and Ketu, or particularly how Jupiter tries to try to have some negotiation with Saturn. And I also look into Venus, because since the Venus is a princess, if it was a male's chart, a man's chart, it would represent the girlfriend, or like the wife, and so on, and the luxury that's bringing into his life. So but Venus can mean luxury for both the man as well as the woman. So women can also use Venus, but in a different aspect. Okay, and for a lady, for a female, for a woman, I would use Mars and Jupiter, because Mars actually means the person that you consider as a partner, but before you get married. So it could be a boyfriend, a casual relationship, anything of that sort. While Jupiter actually means the husband. So the moment they get married, the Mars has now become Jupiter. And then I use Jupiter instead to check how they feel about their husband, or where they might meet their husband. So because some of them, I mean, like many people would have a relationship, but they might not actually end up with that person, right? So they would end up with someone else who is actually the Jupiter. So you need to see how they balance out their energy and all that. And yeah, so I've talked about a few things. Oh yeah, Mars, as I said, it actually deals with war. It deals with the military, like police and all that. So it also could describe the passion inside you, like that desire, that strength within you to go for a goal. You really badly want to get something, you go for it. That's the energy which pushes you. Who gives you that energy to go for it. That's what Mars is. While the Saturn actually, it's like lighting a fire. When you want to light the fire, use Mars. You strike the match and you put it into to whatever that it's going to burn, like petrol. I mean, not petrol. I mean, like anything like wood, and you light it up. But to keep that flame going, you need to like feed in all the necessary twigs and branches and stuff. So for that, we use Saturn. So you need to always see how Mars and Saturn work as well, because their imbalance could cause various problems as well. And yeah, so there are a lot of things going on with these planets, and I've talked about Rahu and Ketu, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, everything. Oh yeah, Mercury is actually about logical thinking, or more like yeah, kind of like any kind of a logical way of approaching something. And it could mean a lot of things nowadays, like even computer, like technology. Yeah, and it could also mean how you communicate, because yeah, I actually need to mention, like later on in more videos, I will actually describe about the signs as well, but according to how they go. And I did mention the 12 houses, and you need to realize that even the signs start from one and goes on towards the end. So the first one we start with is Aries, then we go with Taurus, then we go with Gemini, and so on. So I'll probably have to make another video regarding that, but for the time being, that's about it in terms of the planets. Yeah, so one of my viewers actually sent me an email and a message actually, and then asked me, how is it that even though certain planets might show something good in terms of the planets in the horoscope, in the birth chart, why even though it shows something good, why it might not work out in your life? Well, there's a long answer to this, but I'll try to give a short answer for the moment. You need to realize that the astrology believes that you are born over and over again. Like that's how the karma actually collects all the energy and moves on to the next life. So what we see from horoscope, from at least from my perspective, is the energy that you have gained in your previous lives. What you're doing right now, what you have done since you were born, is not recorded there. Because you might realize that I mentioned the fact, to make that birth chart, you need your birth time. So I have taken what's going on up there and put it into a chart according to the time that you were born. So anything that happened prior to that has affected those planets to be in that way, but not after you're born. So whatever you do after you're born will not be shown on that horoscope. And even though you might have all the good karma from the past lives, if you're a really bad person in this life, who do you think is going to win? Like, of course, it's the bad energy that you collected in this life that's going to win. But it could happen the other way as well. Someone might actually have bad karma from the past. He might do good things in this life, but despite all those good actions, he might not really get the benefits out of them, because he needs to actually pay off the debts first, like the things from his past life. But that doesn't mean that everyone has a constant bad or constant good life. it's always a balance, because it's like a wave. It's like the waves of the ocean. You have the highs and the lows. So when we do a reading, at least when I do a reading, I look at the birth chart, and I also see how the current placements in the sky are affecting the birth chart. Because you might have been born with Jupiter in your first house, but at this very moment Jupiter might be in your seventh house. So I try to see how they play a part in your current life, and also your characteristics which are brought from your previous lives, your tendencies, your desires, your weaknesses, your strengths. And a lot of people might say that astrology isn't for me. I don't think it's for anyone. It's because it's basically a map, and you don't have to stick to it all the time. Just imagine going from point A to point B, and you need a map, probably because you don't know how the road works out. You don't know where to turn, where to stop, and all that. So the same way you would use a GPS if you want to travel from New York to Seattle. So it's a long way, right? You need to have a map. So astrology is basically like a map. It's basically how astronomy was used long time back. They use astronomy to guide them through deserts or like forests or any kind of, because they didn't have Google Maps back then. They didn't have technology. And so I believe that when someone comes to me as a client or as a friend or whoever wants advice from me in terms of astrology, I try to help them by giving them advice, which doesn't always have to be 100%, because it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. I'm just trying to give you an outline of how things might work out in the future according to how I see on the map. That doesn't mean you have to take the same road, because you could take another one, because I would see like 3 different paths for you, and I would say probably path number 2 is the best for you, but you might want to go for path number 1 and 3. That's up to you, right? So the negative, or more like the misinterpretation of astrology is when people think that astrology is 100%. It's not 100%. It has its pros and cons, and you need to know when to use it and when not to use it. If certain things if you feel certain things need to be done a certain way, you just do it that way because you feel comfortable and you feel it's the right way to do it, and it's the best way to do it. So that's basically it. And thanks a lot for coming back and joining this series and like helping me, supporting me throughout this. And if you enjoyed this video and learned something, please give a like if you like this video, and please give me your comments. I'm really sorry for the disturbances, because there's almost like a thunderstorm coming. And then and thanks a lot.